Sally Kidder, author extraordinaire, Vietnam War vet. You're in the process of writing a book about your experiences in Vietnam. And why don't you give us a little background?
In 1960s, I was, of course, in college, and then I went to seminary. And I graduated from a seminary in 1966 from a small seminary outside of Chicago, which is now part of a Methodist seminary near Evanston, Illinois. At the time it was in Naperville, Illinois. And of course, once I was out of seminary, the draft board was after me. People tend to forget that we had a draft back in those days. And of course, from World War II up through the Vietnam War, or a lot of the Vietnam War, we had a draft. I had been approved by the Army to have a nice soft job in Chicago if I wanted it, because I had so much education. I just thought that was chickening out a little bit, and my brother suggested I go in the Navy. So, and I'll tell you one inside story there. I took the test to go in the Navy, and everybody was trying to get in the Navy. Why? Because they didn't want to go to Vietnam, right? And usually you didn't go in if you go to Vietnam if you were in the Navy. If you did go, you were on a ship offshore and you were never touched. But anyway, I finally took his advice, and the first time I'd missed passing it, the test. Then in early '67, like in January, I went up to Buffalo and took the test again at the Reserve Center up there. And the guy came out and said, "Mr. Kidder, I got good news and bad news." I said, "Well, what's the good news?" He says, "You passed. Barely, but you passed." The bad news is I only have one opening at Officer Candidate School next Tuesday at Newport, Rhode Island. I said, "I'll take it." So I took off and went to Newport, Rhode Island, and that started my naval career. And I was in the Navy active duty for 3.5 years, and was on a ship out of Japan. Decided to volunteer to go to Vietnam. I'd been in Vietnam on the ship, but just periodically in Da Nang and a few places. And I had an interest in politics and government. I said, I better not duck this one. This is my generation's war. So I volunteered to go back to Vietnam, and I was put on patrol boats, trained in patrol boats, and then sent it back to Vietnam. That's where I finished my Navy career, active duty.
By the way, just from a visual, can you see that one eyebrow little thing? Go on your other eyebrow. There you go. You're not, no big deal. This is a Jane Kidder thing.
Jane is going to kill me for
okay.
my lack of manicure.
No. This is getting us started. So it gets you to Vietnam, and what was your role there? What was your job?
I was trained, I'd been an operations officer on Minesweepers, which is a small ship out of Japan. Had a great 2 years, really, except one of the reasons I also volunteered is the last captain I had in that small ship of 60 men and 6 officers. It was small. He was sort of a jerk. Not sort of, he was a jerk. And I got tired of working for him. And I said, well, one of the things I could do is I could become in Vietnam, you can become your own captain. And so I was trained in California on small fiberglass boats called PBRs, which stands for Patrol Boat River. They were 32 feet long. They were heavily armed. They had a twin .50 caliber machine gun in the front, a single .50 in the back, or we could put a mortar in the back. And we also had an automatic grenade launcher on the side of some of them. So we had a lot of firepower. The defense, though, and offense were the same with this type of boat. It was speed and maneuverability. We had jet pump propulsion. We had two 250 horse diesel engines that powered jacuzzi pumps. And that meant we didn't have propellers below the bottom of the boat. So we could get up on step. We'd only draw maybe 8 or 12 inches of water, and we could go fast. We could, fast, 32 knots fast. And so our defense, if we came under fire, when we were trained this way, was to get out, to run, and then let the helicopters and other people come in. And later on, when I was in Vietnam, we stopped that type of warfare where we could escape, and we were setting up ambush positions along the Cambodian border. So our mission changed, and that's where I lost a lot of friends, was up on the Cambodian border.
I know we could go into great detail on a lot of that, but you've taken this experience and a relationship with a certain individual and have gone back to Vietnam and are in the process of concluding a book. Talk a little bit about that.
Let me first talk about the person you mentioned, Tu Trung Van. We were Vietnamizing the war. Does this sound familiar? When I was over there in 1969 and 70, we were going to be turning over everything to the South Vietnamese. And so I had Vietnamese officers that I was training to be patrol officers on these boats. And each of the, by the way, as a patrol officer, I had 2 boats that I was in charge of, the one I was on, plus we called the other one a cover boat. So that, again, if one of us came under fire, there was some support there. Tu became on my boat, and I was training him about patrols and how we conducted patrols. And we became friends. He spoke very good English. He'd been to the equivalent of Annapolis over there near Trang. He graduated as an officer in the Vietnamese Navy, South Vietnamese Navy. And I'd sort of kept track of him a little bit, but after I left in 1970, really, we didn't communicate. And then in 1975, it was in May, I think, or early June of 1975, by that time I was in the state legislature in New York, and the phone rang one night, and Jane said, "It's a church group, it must be for you." And I got on the phone, and it was Church World Service, an organization that helps refugees and people like that. And they were calling me from Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, which is outside of Harrisburg. And they said, "Do you know a Tu Trung Van?" I said, "Oh, yes." She said, "Well, he's here with his family. He got out of Vietnam the night the communists took over, and he's been on boats and as a refugee and trying to get, finally he's here in the United States, he'd like to speak with you." I said, "Well, I'd like to speak with him." They didn't have a lot of telephones, so he called back the next day, and the Church World Service guy told me there were 2 requirements. One was that he has to have a job because they didn't want people to go on public assistance. And secondly, they needed a sponsor. And so the First Presbyterian Church over here where I go, they agreed to be a sponsor. And Joe Spitali, a guy I knew at the time who was head of personnel at the Jamestown General Hospital, found him a night watchman job at Jamestown General Hospital. So he had a job. I was going to go down on July 4th, that weekend of July 4th, an extended weekend, to pick him up. So I'd driven my car to Albany for the legislative session. 75 was a year when New York City was bankrupt. The state was close to bankruptcy. We were in session all the time, virtually, and the speaker said, "You got to stay here. We have a tough vote." This was like, I think, on a Thursday. And I was heading out to pick up Tu because I had to have him come up and interview for his job and things like that. And I said, "Well, I'm not going to be here." I said, "I've been a good soldier down here for you all year boating on this stuff." And I said, "I'm going down and pick up my buddy that I haven't seen from Vietnam." And Steingart, who was the speaker, said, "Just a minute." He reached over, picked up a phone he had in his office, and he pushed the direct line to the governor. And Hugh Carey picked it up. "What's the problem, Stanley? What's the problem?" "Well, we got the special session tomorrow. You know, Raleigh Kidder, he's been a good soldier, but he's got to go pick up a Vietnamese friend of his that's at a refugee camp in Pennsylvania. So I'm not going to have him here. And I don't know what I should do." Governor said, "You tell Raleigh Kidder to get out to the airport tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock. The state plane will be waiting for him." He says, "The Commissioner of Corrections thinks he's going to Attica. He's not going to Attica by plane anyway. Raleigh's going to Harrisburg by plane. And you get down there, rent your car, get out, and you can be back here for the special session right after lunch." So I went out to the airport, hopped on this Beach Queen Air or King Air, and flew down to Harrisburg, and I met Tu and got him back. Now, can you imagine, here's a guy that's been running for his life for at least 6 weeks trying to get out of Vietnam. Finally, he lands in Pennsylvania, and the first exposure he has with me after 5 years is on a twin-engine airplane with 2 pilots. I tried to explain to him, I said, "Tu, I'm not a big shot, you know, I'm down on the food chain here." But I said, "There's a sort of a set of circumstances here." And we got to Albany, and I went over to the assembly with Tu, and Steingart hadn't been able to negotiate a deal or whatever it was, and he'd gone to sleep because he'd been up all night, but his wife, Maddie, was there, and she and Abe Beam, the mayor of New York, were having lunch in the assembly chamber, so they invited Tu and I to join them. And can you imagine his first exposure and being in America, really? We're having lunch with the mayor of the city of New York in the assembly chamber. I mean, it was mind-boggling, really. And then he came home. Of course, we drove back to Jamestown and everything happened. And they came here for 2 years. And he went back to JCC, had full-time as well as working a night job. And the weather was, of course, rough on him. And they finally ended up going to Jacksonville, where he got his 4-year degree. And then he worked for Shell Oil in Houston for his career and had retired 4 or 5 years ago. And he was going back home to Vietnam and invited, I said, I want to go back to Vietnam. He said, well, I'll wait over there for you. So we worked out a time. And so when I went back to Vietnam, Tu was waiting for me at the airport and was a heck of a tour guide. I mean, we went back to the rivers we'd fought on, to these little villages. He'd negotiate with a guy to take us on a sampan ride down the river. We'd stop at some of these old fighting locations where we'd had guys killed and ambushed and stuff. And spent a whole week doing that. And then the second week, Gordon Johnston, a friend of mine who'd gone with me, we decided to become tourists, and we went up through Da Nang and Hue and then into Hanoi, of course, where I'd never been in Vietnam. But Tu couldn't have done this without him, and decided that I would, I'd written an article, it got published in the Naval History magazine, and thought that they might be interested in a book. They'd indicated they'd look at it anyway. So I started working on a book. But with Tu involved in it. And then there were 3 guys I knew that were killed, and I said, you know, if I wrote about their families, I think it would be more interesting than me just talking about what I was doing. So over the course of 3 years, I've interviewed the families of 3 guys that were killed, and they're in the story. And we're going to get it published hopefully in February. The Naval Institute said it was a wonderful book, but it was a memoir, and I'm not famous, so they didn't think they could sell enough copies of it. So we're doing it ourselves, basically, and getting it published by a publisher in Indiana, and my son Bart's helping me with it. So, and if you're interested out there on the internet or wherever this is going or not going, it's called Backtracking in Brown Water. And I think it'll be an interesting story of what was happening in 1969 and 1970, both in the country here, as well as in a small part of the war, the southernmost part of South Vietnam, the Mekong Delta.
When you went back and tracked down these 3 friends who passed away, were they friends of yours? I mean, was it part of your crew? Identify those 3 individuals.
The 3 individuals I wrote about represented 3 different types of warfare. The key person, I guess you could say that I've written about, was a chief petty officer, an enlisted man, and his boat was in an ambush position along the Cambodian border. And the night he was killed, had been originally scheduled to be in that location, and then I'd received orders to do something else. And so Chief Tozer his boat was ambushed about 2 in the morning. Boat got driven into a base camp where I was then operating. I was a senior officer down there at the time for the PBRs, and so we had quite a night with wounded men. And the chief died. He got his leg blown off by the B-40 rocket, and he'd lost too much blood. Didn't know at the time. Found out after I started doing research he was a Canadian. He's buried in Canada. So I went to Canada and visited his sister and went to his gravesite. But he represents the types of boats that I was on. Mm-hmm. There was another type of Navy boat used in Vietnam. It was, we called them RAG boats, River Assault Group boats. They were converted landing craft from World War II, the kind that you see at, going into Omaha Beach where the front drops down. Mike boats, we called them in the Navy. Landing craft mechanized. And the Navy in Vietnam took them and adapted them for warfare in the rivers. And they would keep the drop so they could move troops around. But on those boats, they also had built up a landing pad on top so they could land a helicopter on them. They were called Tango boats. We had another boat that was shaved off. It looked like the old Monitor from the Civil War. And it had a 105 howitzer on the end of it, and we called them the monitors, and they could fire 105 howitzers off this small boat, and pretty effectively. And then one of the other boats we had, which was a brutal type of warfare, but very effective, was a Zippo. It was a flamethrower boat. And so these boats, Jim Ross, who was killed on one of those boats, was rag boats, is in the story. And then we worked with the Army, and you gotta remember this, these weren't big units. On a boat like I had, we'd have 5 men, maybe a couple Vietnamese trainees, and maybe 5 on the other boat. So we'd go out on a patrol with maybe 10 or 12 people. The Army in the Mekong Delta had advisors in all these little villages around. Some of the times there'd be 3 or 4. I met a guy, though, that was working by himself with the Vietnamese. And his name was Bob Olson, and he was a heck of a warrior, and there's a chapter in this book about him. I mean, he knew how to take war to the enemy. The first operation I did with him, we went in next to an old destroyed French church that we'd been told was booby-trapped and not to go there, the Navy guys. He didn't care about that. He said, we're going in there. Dropped them off at 10 o'clock, says, pick me up at 3 in the morning. We had flash signals with our flashlights. I picked him up and I said, well, what happened? He said, well, I got one. I said, well, I didn't hear any gunfire because I kept the boats in the area. He said, I didn't use a gun. He says, I killed him with a pop flare, which is a thing that you hit the bottom of it and it goes up and creates light, illumination. He didn't want to use it, but I tell you, about 3 weeks of this guy doing stuff like that, they started not messing with us as much. And it was a safer place. And so, you know, warfare's nasty. It should be ultimately the last resort, I would think, in anybody's choice of things to be doing to resolve problems. And but it's always nasty, and Olson knew how to dish it out to him and made our lives safer. And not that I agreed with everything he did and the way he did it, but I've always believed, I think in my reading of history, that the most effective warfare and the most discriminating and safe way to conduct warfare, if you're going to have it, is the infantryman, because he sees generally the people he's putting away. And whereas if you're 500 feet in a helicopter, or even on a boat like I am, and they're half a mile away, it's a little different, you know. And Olson, unfortunately, he didn't die of gunfire. He died in a boating accident. He was drowned. And he was a great swimmer. We looked for him all night, couldn't find him, got the Vietnamese that were with him fished out of the water. He'd been going out on an ambush in a Boston whaler, a small little thing with probably a 20-horse engine on it or something. And he shouldn't have had more than 4 or 5 people, but more of the Vietnamese wanted to go with him and learn about the way he did his things. And somebody panicked, the boat took on water, they all went in to drink, and the cover boats that were coming behind him were some old French, loud, motorized gunboats from the French days that were being operated by the Vietnamese, and they couldn't hear anything, or everybody was running a darkened ship. Of course, you're talking about darkness here. And when we found his body the next morning, he had a big gash in the back. So he either got hit by the boat or by the propeller of the boat. But he was swimming. He had all of his clothes off. His bandoliers of ammunition were off. He was swimming and he was really, he wore black pajamas like the enemy did. He carried an AK-47, thought it was better than the M16. I mean, he sent messages by the way he conducted warfare, and the enemy didn't like it, and started to back off. And it's a lesson of, one of the lessons you learn. I mean, I guess I learned it, as I say, by the tutored hand of Bob Olson, what this kind of warfare is all about. So he's the Army guy. But again, we're not talking about an Army division of platoons going out and getting into firefights and stuff like that. These are small little things, you know, but that's what we did.
Well, you individualized these folks and tracked down their families. What was the reaction when you talked to them? Did you dig up some memories that were hard for them?
You know, there was, Tozer's family was probably the most sad things I found out. This is the chief that was killed and I watched him die, and we were putting a lot of wounded people on helicopters that night to get him out. And he had come back. His wife had been killed in an automobile accident in California in September of '69. And he came back after the funeral. He didn't have to. I'm sure the Navy would have let him off the hook because he had 4 kids. But maybe it was because he had felt obligation to his unit. Part of it might have been that he was a career Navy guy and thought it would look bad if he didn't go back. But he came back to Vietnam, and he was killed in November, 2 months later. Had a hard time finding his kids. They'd moved around, and his Tozer's sister in Canada told me, though, that they'd been raised near Grand Rapids, and I went on one of the people search engines, and I finally found a Janet Tozer Rasmussen. And I called one night on the phone, and like a Greg Peterson often does, my name is Greg Peterson. I said, well, my name is Riley Kidder, and I was in Vietnam. Just a moment, you want to talk to my wife. And I got on the phone with her, and yes, it was her father. So I went out to see her, and she and her sister interviewed him, typed up the interviews. And they very much want to see the book. I'm quite interested in that aspect of it. All the families have an interest in seeing this thing published, so that's another impetus for me to get it done. But just to say a word more about the Tozer kids, the night their mother died in an automobile accident, their dad was in Vietnam with us. She was killed in a brutal traffic accident. A lot of it was her own doing. I think she'd been out partying, to be honest with you. And 2 of the 4 in the car were killed, including her. And they didn't know, they had a hard time identifying her. So the babysitter taking care of the 4 kids, the mom never came home. So she called 911 or the police, and she got put into a juvenile detention facility when she was, I think at the time, 9 or 7, and all her other kids were younger. And they separated the kids, and so she's looking at her sister through a fence, a cyclone fence kind of thing, because it was segregated by age or something. They were just crying their hearts out. They didn't know what had happened, of course. And then 3 days later, their dad comes in. They flew him home from Vietnam, emergency leave. And of course, wow, things were, thank God Dad's home, and had this homecoming. And they didn't realize until he got there that their mom had died. I mean, they hadn't been told. He had to tell them, Eldon, Chief Tozer. He said, I'm going to go back to the boat, but you're going to go down and stay with my brother and his family in Oklahoma. And while I'm gone, I'll be back right after Christmas. So he goes back to Vietnam. Of course, then he gets killed. And her uncle calls her out of school and takes her home, and there's the whole family again. And she hadn't put 2 and 2 together, she said, and finally they told me my dad had died, and she said, I don't remember anything after that. You know, and so here's the 9-year-old, 7-year-olds, 2 7-year-olds, and a 4-year-old. And they're on their own. They got put into an orphanage because the brother who was taking care of them went through a divorce, couldn't take care of his own 4 kids. So what are you going to do with these 4 kids? Well, they're going to go in an orphanage. And of course, that was another bad experience. And finally, another aunt, finally a year later, found him in the orphanage, brought him up to Grand Rapids, and raised him. But, you know, it's a story about the collateral damage in war, I guess. You never could have painted a picture like this, really, of a family so it became quite dysfunctional, obviously, and a lot of sadness because of 2 deaths coming so close together, and one being in Vietnam when their dad died. So anyway, it's been quite interesting, and there's still you know, I'll tell you one more story, and then my time is up. You've got to get somebody else in here. The guy that was killed, who was on the River Assault Group, the heavier boats, Jim Ross, was a Lieutenant JG like I was. And I got to know Ross pretty well because when we weren't down on these small canals, we'd be back on a supply type ship in the big Mekong River, right down from the Cambodian border. But the Mekong's a wide river. It's like the Mississippi. So you feel like you're in a lake. You feel safe. You know, I mean, it's way out. When you're on these little canals, I mean, it's like twice the width of 4th Street sometimes, going down these canals, and you don't have any time to do anything except shoot and run kind of stuff. But on the vessel we were on, the YRBM-20, which in Navy parlance means berthing, messing, and repair facility, YRBM. We had air-conditioned staterooms, we had nice food, we had clean sheets. It was like the old Navy. And somebody, probably an enlisted man, figured out, it was always illegal in the Navy to have beer or liquor on a ship, right? It was always illegal to have it. We'd keep it on our ship when I was in the Navy, but if we wanted to drink it, we had to be in a foreign port and take the motor whaleboat over to a beach or something. So people could get drunk on the beach, and then we bring them back on the motor whaleboat to the ship, but never drinking on a ship. That was one of the Navy rules. Well, somebody said, well, what if we bought a barge and tied it up to this barge? Well, I guess that's okay. I mean, it didn't say you couldn't do it in the Navy regs, right? So some people went together, bought a barge, tied the thing up to the other big barge type thing we were living on, and every night at 6 o'clock, beer call, and we'd all go down a gangplank onto this, and they'd put a little steel hooch up there with an air conditioner and a fridge in it. And we'd drink beer for a couple hours right after dinner, and then we'd go to bed, And I got to know this guy, Ross. He liked to go to the beer barge. We'd sit down, and he was very, very smart, quiet-spoken. Me, I talk before I think, not Ross. He'd always say, well, I think you're right, I think you're wrong. And we'd talk politics. He almost went into the church as a Roman Catholic priest, whereas I'd been in a seminary going in a Protestant direction. So we had a lot of theology we talked about and stuff like that. So the night he was killed, it was a bad night, and I wasn't down on the river. I was playing bridge in an air-conditioned stateroom in the middle of the Mekong River. And all of a sudden, the word came in there had been a fatality. And the word, we didn't know for a couple hours, and then finally we found out it was him. And I chased his family down, and they found him in Long Island. And as I left the interview after 4 or 5 hours, I was exhausted, of course, meeting 2 of his sisters and a brother. And we talked one more time about him, and they always called him Jimmy. They never called him Jim. I always called him Jim. They all did call him. And they said, he was always Jimmy to us. He'll be forever young, And that's the way they look at it. And so that's a story in there, too.
Has this been hard for you to revisit this?
Not as much as I thought. I wanted to go back to Vietnam. I thought that was fulfillment in a way. I think there's been some catharsis for me in actually talking to the families of these people. It sort of brings it full cycle, brings it back. But there's been some moving times, and probably post-Vietnam, it's hard to say. I think maybe the most poignant part of the book for me was going to Tozer's grave in Quebec. It's a little 100, there's not 100 people in this cemetery, and it's right in the village where he grew up. And it's up on a bluff that overlooks a river that runs into the sea. And wow, couldn't be better.